Hello everybody, my name is John Sheldon. I'm an associate partner with Azurex, we're a space technology company in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. I'm also a special advisor to the space unit at the Policy Exchange, which is a think tank in London, England. So today I'm moderating the Global Governance of Space panel for the Kalpana Trawler Annual Space Policy Dialogue hosted by the Observer Research Foundation. So thanks to them for bringing us all together. We're joined today by an illustrious panel, international panel as well, and we're joined by Laetitia Cesari Zarkan, who's a consultant for the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, as well as the Director of Programming at the Court Foundation. Mr. Daniel Porras, who's the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications at the Secure World Foundation, and he's joining us very early in the morning, his time, from Colorado in the United States. Mr. Claudio Leopoldino, who is the head of the Disarmament and Sensitive Technologies Division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil. And then last but not least, Mr. Antonino Salmeri, who is the co-lead of Space Exploration Project Group in the Space Generation Advisory Council. So thank you all for joining us, and we're going to have an interesting panel. At least I will make sure we will. We'll leave about 5 or 7 minutes at the end for questions and answers from the audience. So those in the audience who have any questions, please message the hosts and they'll come through to us, and we'll try to get answer as many as we can. If we don't, please email the moderators, the hosts, and we'll pass them on to whoever you would like to answer. So just for a bit of context, obviously space governance is very much in the news on a range of issues. Unfortunately, most recently we've had the Russian anti-satellite test, which raises many of the issues that we're going to be talking about. We've also had allegations that China has tested a fractional orbital bombardment system, but it's not just Chinese and the Russians, of course. We're seeing the launch of mega constellations, which raise many policy and regulatory issues, as well as dangers of collision and frequency allocations and orbital slots and so forth, and of course the perennial problem of space debris and other issues. We're also on the cusp of what seems to be a new race for the moon, which will include apparently resource extraction of the moon, but also other celestial bodies such as asteroids. So we're approaching a pivotal moment, you could argue, in the history of space policy and governance, where a number of fundamental questions are going to have to be addressed at the institutional and diplomatic level. And so today's panel, we're going to discuss what those issues are, how we might go about doing it, if we do anything at all. So I'm going to pose a number of fundamental questions on these issues to a panel, and I'll basically ask each one to give 2 to 3 minutes comments on each question, and then we'll go to the next round and so on, and then the Q&A at the end. So the first question I basically is about the current outer space governance regime, which is mostly based on the Outer Space Treaty, which was originally signed in 1968 and covers many areas, of course, but was also in many senses deliberately ambiguous on a number of issues that are now coming to the fore. And so one of the more fundamental questions is the current space governance regime fit for purpose? Do we need to upgrade it? Do we need to make any changes? Can it address many of these challenges that we are currently facing or about to face? And I would like to start with Antonino on that issue in terms of what his views are. Antonino.
So thank you very much, John, and thanks everybody for joining us and for having me today. It's a great pleasure sharing views on such an interesting topic, global space governance. I was really thinking about what could be said in few minutes that is meaningful in such a fundamental and complicated topics. What I believe that the global space governance. So I will tell you 2 things. One is that I think is still functioning, and one that we need to improve. I'll start with what we need to improve, which is that global space governance needs to become more multi-stakeholder and more diverse. At this point in time, we still have states as the main center of the global governance of space activities, which is completely fine and makes sense given that the legitimacy to take ultimate decision is in the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and that is open to states, of course. On the other hand, though, we cannot tackle issues like space debris or issue like lunar governance or the complicated behavior that we see around space security only with states. We need to expand the conversation and the inclusion decision-making processes to other institutions, other entities, and other stakeholders. So we need to do much better in terms of inclusiveness, and we need to develop processes that connect who is empowered to take the decisions, so the states, the diplomacy world, with the real world. So the companies, but not also the companies, also the institutions. For my part, the young generation, but also having a much more participation of people from developing countries and women, of course. So that is something that we need to work on. What I think is functioning at the moment, and I hope it will for the future, is the legal framework that we have for that. Because the international system of space law is nevertheless still working well. It's serving the purpose of maintaining space functioning, peaceful, and to a certain extent sustainable, even though we can do better. So I would say that the foundations that we have are solid enough for us to build, and that is something to keep in mind, because oftentimes I hear criticism of the Outer Space Treaty that it's too old, too vague, and I disagree with these criticisms. I think that we have a great legal basis to build upon. We just need to fill some gaps, which are obviously naturally when you develop a treaty that lasts for more than 50 years and hopefully will last 100 years. But on the other hand, we should not forget that we have great principles that are still shaping up our discussion today: the freedom to use outer space, the non-appropriation principle, the due regard principle, and the peaceful usage of space, of course. So I would say that we have a good legal foundation, but we need to develop new mechanisms to make sure that the governance of space reflects the composition of the space community, which at the moment is probably not happening. Those are my thoughts, but I'm sure that others can contribute further to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Antonino. Actually, this is a good segue for Claudio to make some comments, because Antonino mentioned, Claudio, that the fundamental legal basis is probably still sound, but we need to bring in others into the discussion, such as the private sector and other diverse groups as well. You're a diplomat, Claudio, representing a large state. So what's your view on that, as well as also just the general question?
Thank you, John. Thank you, and thank you also to ORF for the organization of this event and for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on this. I certainly agree wholeheartedly with what Antonino has just said. My impression is that existing norms and regulations are definitely not enough. They're not sufficient as they stand to address emergent challenges in outer space. But like Antonino, I also believe that what we have, we should not throw the baby out of with the bathwater, because we have a very important and solid foundation. The Outer Space Treaty contains a host of fundamental principles that remain valid and important today. Some of them are very vague, granted, but what we need, in my view, is to develop further on them. The due regard principle, for example, is one area in which I think it's absolutely fundamental that we preserve that principle that states in their conduct of space activities do not interfere harmfully in other states' activities, and have due regard for future interests as well. And this is coming from a state that already has significant space capabilities, but has even greater aspirations to become a fully seafaring nation, and also bearing in mind the perspectives of states that have no such aspirations, but are already dependent on space for practically all aspects of social economic life, and need to ensure that space remains peaceful, stable, and usable. I think that one area that is particularly urgent is the area of prevention of arms races in outer space. This has become even more urgent in recent years. in the Conference on Disarmament, we had almost 40 years of discussions with little to show for it. In COPIUS, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, there's been more tangible progress. During Brazil's chairmanship, 21 guidelines on LTS, on long-term sustainability, were adopted. These were an important first step, but certainly those discussions need to continue, because the most sensitive and security-related aspects of that discussion on LTS could not garner consensus at the time in which the first batch of guidelines were adopted, and we certainly hope that this will continue. And within the UNGA, there's been signs of progress that are encouraging, with the adoption of resolution proposed by the UK on reducing space threats. This has led to a dialogue on how to move forward from what I've been calling a bottom-up approach. For years, we have been insisting on a top-down approach in which states get together, decide what should be done, and or at least that's the objective, and adopt legally binding instruments to regulate their own conduct in outer space in a very formal way. What the UK resolution has tried to do is to switch the focus and do this from a bottom-up perspective. And I think that's encouraging, and we're certainly look forward to what the results will be.
Thank you, Claudia. Laetitia, one of the things that is emerging in the space security debate is this rivalry between those who are looking to who wish to promote space norms, as is the case with the recent UK-sponsored resolution, and then on the other hand, those who are looking to promote a legally binding treaty-based approach to space security. What's your views on that?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much to the ORF for inviting me to the discussion. I believe that the international framework is enough, and then we can, adapt some of the things. And Antonino and Claudio mentioned, the main principle of the Outer Space Treaty. I also wanted to mention, for instance, the international consultation, because from what we've seen, there was like this disruptions this past few years. Let's say states, decided to test some of their system from the ground to space. This is, let's say, a step they accept and they assume to take, but like in international law right now, even though the Outer Space Treaty bans weapons of mass destruction in space, there has been little success in controlling this type of conventional weapons targeting space systems or even weapons placed in outer space, and in spite of substantial efforts over 5 decades already. So there were initiatives that came from different member states. We can mention also the PPWT, so the Treaty on Preventing the Placements of Weapons in Outer Space, on which Russia and China are working, and they are updating over the years. And there is an interesting fact that last April, so in April 2021, they called for other states to come at the table of negotiations. And China and Russia are working on a real multilateral instrument. This is very interesting because, we can, be for or against this type of binding instrument, but, it's on the table of the negotiations. They are calling for other members of the Conference on Disarmament to be a part of the negotiations on the same level, It's not one state being followed by the others. The public declarations were about being all together around the same tables. So, there are some observers that are questioning the success of the enterprise. They are, doubting that states will collaborate together, but others consider this as a good starting point. And multilateralism, it seems to be one of the top priorities for this type of question for China and Russia. And this is very interesting. And from the other hand, it was mentioned, there is this initiative on the reduction of space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior. And, this is sponsored by the UK, even though like a lot of other states were a part of the discussions and were a part of it. And what comes from it since last month is that they will put an open-ended working group that will meet in Geneva in 2022 and 2023 for 2 sessions, 5 days each. This is a very good step as well. And this is not like in opposition to the treaty I mentioned before, but complementary. And it's great to see that even though we have a very interesting and, sustainable regime, we can still adapt, we can still discuss. And, in space, especially when it involves, new systems, new technology, we recognize that there is a big part of subjectivity. We cannot say, okay, this is a definition of an object because, tomorrow it will be another system. So we cannot really find a way to, to base our reflection on an object. But thinking about behavior, thinking about what is not okay is very important. It's also very subjective. It depends on the countries, it depends on the time, but we cannot set in stone an objective definition or an objective purpose that will be, too constraining. But what we can agree on is what frightens us, what scares us for the future of space activities. And because activities are constantly changing, we cannot be bound to this is a threat, this is not, because technology and interests are changing. And what is at stake today is not the same as what will be at stake tomorrow,
Okay. Thank you, Laetitia. Daniel, you're our resident international man of mystery, given your background. It seems to me that, and I once told you, and I think it was in this very event a couple of years back, that geopolitics is back with a capital G. And yet it appears to me that, unfortunately, the major powers, the United States, Russia, China, India, others, have never been so far apart from each other. There seems to be not a breakdown in global governance, but certainly a major strain. And Colin Gray once said that the problem with arms control is that there's a paradox. When you most need it, i.e. when things are most tense, it can't work. And when you least need it, when things are thawing and countries are getting along, it comes along very easily. Would you say that this characterization that we're in a very tense time is an accurate one? And if so, what is it you think we can do to bring powers to the table to bring about a more productive discussion that the other panel have suggested?
Yeah, and that's a really difficult question. As Laetitia, and thanks, John. I really appreciate you giving me the tough stuff at 6 o'clock in the morning. Also, want to say many thanks to Raji and the ORF team for inviting us and hosting this discussion. So, how bad are relations right now between U.S., Russia, China, India? A lot of other partners are starting to get involved in this counter space dynamics that we're seeing, and I think a great example of it is just the way that we interpret even the most basic fundamental activities that different countries are engaging in. So, good example: China launches an active debris removal device. Western response automatically, it's a weapon. Didn't even blink before we started seeing a lot of reactions coming from various sources, rather hawkish sources, of course, that said, like, that's not an active debris removal device. It is some kind of a weapon that will be used to attack Western satellites. Likewise, many times when we see the Western endeavors in this exact same field, a lot of newspapers and a lot of reactions from the Russians and the Chinese will also often say that's a weapon, without even really any type of engagement, any type of dialogue. It's just a characterization of the types of activities that we're seeing. So that, I would say, is endemic of the level of trust that we have at the moment. Doesn't matter what you do, it's automatically something threatening. So how do we come back from that? How do we pull ourselves back from the brink? And in all your optimism, no, this is not going to be easy to do. There are a lot of really bad feelings, I think, between countries and the rhetoric, the activities that are taking place. Things like the Russian ASAT test are not going to make it very easy for everyone to come back to the table, in good faith, to come to the table and say, we're ready to work together and to try and bridge these differences. However, what we are seeing is that the stakes are getting higher and higher. In the old days, an ASAT test, kind of like during Operation Burt Frost, not even during Operation Solwind back in 1985, when the U.S. Blew up a satellite with a fighter jet launched missile. Not anywhere near as many satellites as we had, and certainly we didn't have an International Space Station up there. I think part of what really was so compelling about the test on Monday was seeing the International Space Station go into a lockdown emergency mode and having to move. Oh, and never mind the fact that it's also right around one of the orbits that is going to be most used by the mega constellations in the next couple of decades. So we cannot do these types of activities anymore because the stakes are simply too high. And we're all becoming quite dependent on space systems. Militaries, modern militaries, more than anyone, are dependent on these space systems. And so what we're trying to find now is how do we set up some guardrails? It's obvious that we're not going to make peace with one another anytime soon, and it doesn't matter where we go, air, land, sea, space, we're always going to be people. We bring what we have with us. But how do we make sure that our conflicts and our disagreements don't lead to disasters that are irreversible? That's what I think we have to have a reckoning about. And if we don't do it soon, I think we are seeing the pattern. We saw it on Monday, and it's not good.
Yeah, I wish I could be more optimistic as well, but unfortunately, I fear, Daniel, that you're onto something. So, but I also knew you would be able to handle it diplomatically. So, thank you for that. Next round of questions is, and I think this can follow on from what Daniel's comments imply. I sense that given where we are diplomatically, maybe some more imaginative approaches might be needed, especially in the new group that's been formed to explore the UK-sponsored resolution. And one of those is if we're going to look at new forms of regulation or other forms of governance, where else can we look to for ideas? And we look often for the maritime analogy in space. So the law of the sea, for example, is always a good example. Another one might be the Antarctic Treaty. But what about, for example, some of the new climate agreements that are coming out? And I know that there's a lot of political problems with these in terms of countries meeting their commitments. But is there anything, not just climate, but other forms of international agreements in other areas that perhaps we could look at for new ideas on how we govern our activities in space? And maybe, Claudio, you can start us off on that.
Definitely. I think that there are many possibilities for us. I think for a long time we insisted on a very classic arms control arrangement when it comes at least to regulating the conduct of states and space in terms of possible security implications. And this, at least for the time being, hasn't worked. So I think that, as I said before, a different approach is being tried now. Laetitia already described in the previous round how the OEWG is going to work, and I just want to highlight that this approach does not imply, the approach of the OEWG discussing norms and principles does not imply that we're setting aside the option of reaching a legally binding instrument. The very mandate of the OEWG already makes reference to that, and certainly something that we as a country, that Brazil, haven't abandoned as an aspiration. As recently as 2019, Brazil chaired the group of governmental experts that had the precise mandate of exploring possible principles for treaty on Paris. So we certainly still want to see that, but As Daniel said, and yourself, John, trust is at the, I wouldn't say all-time low, but at the pretty low point among major spacefaring nations. I take a bit of issue with your quote of Professor Gray. I think that in some cases, arms control can work even in the height of tensions, and I think that we shouldn't hope or wait for these tensions to go away in order to pursue effectively arms control agreements. I think that these are mutually reinforcing phenomena. So I think that perhaps this bottom-up approach, developing gradually principles, norms, and norms that can evolve further into hard law in the future, is certainly something that we think is a breath of fresh air in our discussions. Plurilateral initiatives such as the Artemis Accords can also contribute to that end on the peaceful aspects of space exploration, but there is no substitute to true multilateralism, because space is not just the domain of current spacefaring nations. They are the domain of the whole of mankind, of humankind, and we need to ensure that all states, because all states have a skin in this game, have their views represented.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Laetitia, we need new ideas, as I said earlier, so please, your ideas for how we can bring about some progress in space security.
I will do my best. So, basically, one of the things that I fear a bit is that even though we put together, the best treaties and the best regimes of control, non-proliferation, etc., if there is any crisis, any strategic will or whatever, states will just not comply with it. And we've seen it in the past, like depending on the person at the head of this state or that state, they just decide to withdraw. And this is something that is a bit scary, because we work so long on different texts, and this is what we do. We put our life and energy and time on this. And then because there is a political will, it just blow up. And this is a bit, complicated. But, for each time there is a different political strategy. And for space, for instance, if we speak about commercial and civilian, it depends on available technology, it depends on political will, and it's also linked with, to the state of the relationship between different states, their rivals, their partners, and also their private entities. And this is why also we emphasize the role of private entities, because when there is an economic and commercial interest, then we can negotiate. We talk about money, we can negotiate, and on this different aspect, maybe there is some leverage that we can find. And this is why not only the reason why, but this is why we can find an interest in involving the private sector. So, for instance, if we talk about the open-ended working group, they call for the participation of intergovernmental institutions, departments, and organizations of the United Nations. This is very interesting, but also commercial players, civil society members, involved in the negotiation on space threats and security. This is fascinating, involving commercial players into the game. And, as long as there is a standard practice, there is a room for negotiation. And there will be, of course, analysis of international agreement, normative framework, etc. But this is the job of diplomats. Now, when we have economic interests, the rules are not the same. And just to mention very quickly the role of public society, the people working, the academics, my colleagues in think tank, I mentioned the importance of thinking about what is the most important issue. We already regulated weapons of mass destruction. Let's talk about conventional weapons. And there were some texts that were written in the past few years, but also initiatives. So, for instance, we can talk about the development of ASAT test guidelines. This was first initiated in 2013 by a group of governmental experts on outer space transparency and confidence building measures. It's very interesting because it takes some of the tools and instruments from other regimes, And there is a great space dossier on ASAT test guideline written by Daniel Porras here and published by UNIDIR. We also had a general call for, banning anti-satellite tests to build a more comprehensive arms control regimes and prevent the production of debris, for long-term sustainability. And we already have guidelines on this. So, there was an article published by Thomas Cheney for King's College London, one by Nivedita Raju, for CIPRI. There was also this letter, and then we talk a lot about involving a lot of names. So the Outer Space Institute submitted a letter that was signed by many people, experts in space. So it was submitted to the United Nations General Assembly to take up for consideration kinetic anti-satellite test ban treaty. And also we can discuss about the initiative for an additional protocol that was, first emitted by Paul Meyer, the former Canadian ambassador. So there are some voices that are raising, and now we have to put all the brains at the same place, and try to find the best regime.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, Laetitia essentially spoke about their multi-stakeholder approach to these this problem and these issues, including the private sector. Secure World Foundation is a prominent organisation in these discussions. Can you encapsulate what their views are in terms of how we should approach the issues right now?
Yeah. Rule number one, don't blow things up in the process. Let's talk it out before we do irreversible damage. Secure World Foundation's position on space security has been diplomacy for years. The idea is that we need to sit down and talk about what are our differences, where are the areas that we can find common interests, and how do we do these things without endangering the long-term sustainability of outer space and our ability to leverage outer space for so many great benefits down here on Earth. For us, this is it's a practical question. It is a question where a lot of leadership needs to come together and try to find common areas of interest. But I think we're also kind of starting to wander off into another realm. And since Laetitia's already done such a great job of talking about sort of the tangible, technical ways that we might be able to tackle these issues, I actually am going to go off a little bit more on a slightly different tangent, which is Secure World Foundation and a lot of other folks are working to make sure that we don't do too much damage before we finally get, in no uncertain terms, a generation that can figure this one out. We come with a lot of baggage, and this baggage, as time goes on, changes, evolves. We shed some of it, we take on some new stuff. But working with organizations like Space Generation and fantastic young people like Laetitia and others who are coming through, I think we're starting to find new dynamics that are percolating underneath that I'm hoping will create new relationships and new diplomatic ties in the future that will enable different types of conversations. You and I know well that the U.S. and Russia have a long-standing history with Star Wars and the legacy of Ronald Reagan. And sometimes I think it continues to be a barrier for arms control discussions. Some of the younger folks don't even know who Ronald Reagan was or what the hell Star Wars was all about. And I think they bring a new approach to it. So as we see these new young diplomats, new folks starting to write on space security, on a lot of these issues, they're creating the bonds and the relationships, I think, that, maybe 10, 20, 30 years down the line will actually crack this nut. But in the meantime, we got to figure out how to keep it all from falling apart.
Yeah, good point. And as maybe the oldest person on this panel, I'm over 50, not just they don't remember what Star Wars was in terms of the Missile Defense Strategic Defense Initiative in the 1980s, they don't even know what the good Star Wars movies were like. Never mind the latest generation of Star Wars movies. The world's going apart, not just in space. But anyway, Antonino, I haven't forgotten you, but to Daniel's point, you're also a member of the Space Generation Advisory Council. I also know that you're deeply involved in the Moon Village Association, which is also exploring how we regulate activities on the Moon. Can you talk to us a bit about how you look at how we can, take in some new approaches to governing space and its activities there?
Thanks, John. And, here I'm a little bit of an outsider because you hear a lot about space security and you have amazing experts on these very tangible issues. And I work mostly on lunar governance and space resources, so I bring a little bit of a different angle to that. But I'm very glad that Daniel mentioned the importance of, cooperating with the young generation and having a long-term perspective that will allow us to do better and to inherit a better world than the one that we are receiving right now in space. And I'll give you one example, which is based on real practice from Space Generation Advisory Council. So within SGC, I do not only lead the Space Exploration Project Group, I'm also the lead of a dedicated team on lunar governance, which is called EAGLE. And EAGLE stands for Effective and Adaptive Governance for a Lunar Ecosystem. Now, this team was created last year with the purpose of developing the position of the young generation as a whole on the regulation of lunar activities. And so after 1 year of work, we came up with a report that all of you can find online. It's called the Lunar Governance Report of Space Generation Advisory Council. It was endorsed by the entire organization. And in this report, we propose a change in narrative because, as exactly you were mentioning before, one of the issues that we have is that the current generation has a lot of baggage, and the terminology we use matters. And this terminology is sometimes the thing that is standing between us and potential solutions. What we do in the EAGLE report is that for the regulation of lunar activities, we propose the development of a new instrument, which we call a Lunar Governance Charter. And as a space lawyer, I can tell you that the charter, the use of a charter has never been proposed in space. We have examples of other charters, like the Charter of the United Nations or Magna Carta, but nothing that happened in space. And why we came up with the idea of a charter, the benefit of it is first that it's new, and second that it's fluid as a terminology. We use charters to describe legally binding instruments, but also non-directly legally binding instruments. And a charter to us encapsulates a general but also cohesive approach. To me, a charter speaks in a more solemn way than guidelines, for instance, right? When we thought about what should be the instrument regulating the next generation of lunar activities, we didn't want to have another set of guidelines. With all due respect to guidelines, of course, because they speak to a technical, concrete type of regulation, which is, of course, very much needed, but does not even get close enough to the cultural importance of something like the moon, and I would say of space in general. And so we propose this terminology that is new, that tells you that we have to redefine and reinvent the way we talk in order to come up with better solutions. And those solutions have to be adaptive and effective at the same time. So the problem that Daniel mentioned, how do we avoid that everything falls apart until we figure it out, is exactly the problem of adaptive governance. And my view, the Space Generation Advisory Council view on this, is that we need to develop middle-level instruments that will allow us to agree on the fundamental boundaries of what we want to do in regulation, while also allowing us the flexibility to develop it. So in the Lunar Governance Charter that we propose, you hear that we have fundamental principles that will tell you, okay, we agree, for instance, on the interpretation of safety zones as a concept, right? What do we want to achieve with the safety zone? What is going to be the main features of it? But it will not tell you exactly how safety zone big will be or for how long you can have one and things like that. Because to that, we need to evolve. We need to learn a little bit better how do we operate on the moon. But we still know when we say safety zone that everybody understands the same thing. Because one of the issues that we have at the moment is that you use this term and people understand different things. So what we need to do in regulation, in new legal instruments, is to agree on principle level that will allow us to implement a little bit more the Outer Space Treaty. So from the very, very vagueness of the Outer Space Treaty to a little bit less vagueness, And that already, having those boundaries cleared, will allow us to develop further regulation in harmony. Because at the end of the day, what we want to avoid is tension, is conflict, in the sense that we suspect of the intentions of the others. But if we have a common starting point where we clarify contentious points at the level of principle, that will already, at least in our view, make a fundamental difference in enabling the development of better regulation. And for that, cooperating with the young generation is essential. So that's why we are always very happy as SGC to participate in events and to contribute actively, because we bring that new, fresh perspective, the lack of certain baggage, as Daniel said. That is what will make a difference, I believe, in the success of the regulation of space activities in the future.
Thank you very much, Antonino. I myself am swayed, but I'm now going to play devil's advocate. We have less than 10 minutes. I'm going to pose 2 questions to each of the panelists, and I want you to, I'm going to pose the 2 questions now, and please answer them in less than 2 minutes each, so we can finish on time. So the 2 questions are this. First, despite everything we've just been saying here, the international institutes that provide the mechanism for these discussions are what states make of them. States themselves are looking out for themselves in their own national interests, and therefore there is no real sense of the greater good of making this work for everybody. It's all about delaying tactics or some sort of asymmetric approach to make sure no one gets an advantage. Tell me I'm wrong. How do we overcome this? Can we overcome this in order to advance these discussions and stop bad things happening in the short term, so that when the next generation matures enough to take control of the levers of power, we can come to solutions? And then the second question is, how do you see things panning out in the next 5 years? Is there cause for optimism, or is there cause for even deeper pessimism? Laetitia, over to you.
Thank you very much for the 2 questions. I will do my best to answer the first. About the second, I will just say that I try to be an optimist, but there is still a lot of work to do, and I'm sure that we will all together find, common interest that will be good to foster, the negotiations. Just for the first question, we just need to keep in mind that outer space is, breaking through. It's not like it's a domain, but it's also breaking through several domains. And I like this example of, this 24 hours without space, because we see how essential it is to preserve long-term sustainability, activities in outer space, etc. And, we need it for air activities, land, maritime operations, and in a way, it's very similar to cyberspace. And, it's interesting to see that even for cyberspace, we haven't found the good legal instruments or, the good framework. It's just existing. We do our best to maintain it and not to let hostile operations proliferate. But, there is no legal instrument, but it still works in some way. And basically, there are some rules, there are some best practices, but the key is for each one to act as a reasonable and prudent actor. Everybody has its own interest. Nobody wants to facilitate a bad operation that is targeting one of their ally or themselves. So the key, in my opinion, will be to act as a prudent and reasonable actor in outer space, in cyberspace, obviously, and then to facilitate the different negotiations, because everybody has an interest in outer space.
Thank you. Daniel?
5 years prediction. We're doomed. No, I think we're going to get an ASAT test ban within the next 5 years. It might take a little while. The OEWG will probably kick things off, but I think we'll at least get that far, and that builds momentum. And then afterwards, maybe we can talk about some more ambitious things. In terms of how do we get everybody to do it without some folks feeling like they're being constrained and some folks feeling like they're not, like they're being left behind. I think we're going to end up with an agreement where hopefully no one is happy all the way. We need to find an interest where it's a topic where everyone's interests converge, and start small, very focused, very specific. The last chair of the group of governmental experts on Paros, Ambassador Patriota, did a great job of trying to find where those interests were, and I think ASAT testing is a really good example. So fingers crossed. We'll see where we go.
Antonino?
Well, I'll try to be brief on this one. I think that the answer to, how to overcome this particularism and eventually have people think about the greater good is a classic game theory problem, right? It's like, what are the interests and what do you have to gain or lose if you behave looking at your own interests primarily or looking at the group? Now, for me, the answer to this problem, which is similar to the prisoner dilemma, is essentially more inclusiveness and multi-stakeholderism. I come back to what I said at the beginning, but I give you one concrete example, which is the Global Expert Group on Sustainable Lunar Activities, of which I'm part and which is promoted by the Moon Village Association. I'll give you a very astonishing example that the group on safety zone and environmental protection, the subgroup in which we're operating and discussing this stuff, is co-chaired by an American and Chinese colleague. They're working together, representing two countries which diplomatically will not be able to talk about this thing. But what they're doing in Gagzla will be brought home. What the experience of having Chinese and Americans and Russians and Italians and everybody working without the constraints of diplomacy in a multi-stakeholder civil platform is what will help us overcome these problems. Because I can assure you, when we have our monthly meeting in Gagzla, we're not speaking anymore as countries, we're not speaking anymore as particular interests, we're speaking because we want to have a shared future in space. And so platforms like those are hopefully becoming the key, I would say, to solving this counterposition and this focus on regional or particular interests that states unfortunately have, and I will say will always have. So we need to expand and have others involved in the conversation so that we can dilute this tendency, which will always be natural for states. Because this is already happening, and I think we are on a good track, I am optimist for the future. I cannot speak about space security because I'm no expert, but I can tell you that in the same time horizon that Daniel mentioned, in 5 years, hopefully we will have principles for the utilization of space resources, because in addition to the open-ended working group, also the legal subcommittee of COPE was created, a new working group on space resources. And that is exactly the time horizon for that group to produce fundamental principles. And hopefully those can also apply to lunar activities. So I would say that there is momentum increasing, and hopefully in 5 years we can have this panel again and comment on these tangible results and be even more optimistic for the future.
Wonderful. And then 90 seconds, Claudio, can you just wrap up for us in terms of from where you sit?
Thank you very much. I will try to be as brief as possible. Yes, I think that there's a lot of the different tactics going on below the rhetoric, and that's been preventing progress in this field. I think there's a lot of reason to be optimist in this realm. I think I'm always optimistic. I try to be, at least otherwise I can't function as a diplomat. One of the good things is that unlike cyberspace, I think that states have very little incentive to start a conflict in outer space and to actually carry out aggressive actions. Mainly because, unlike outer space, anonymity is not as strong, and the dynamics of this possible realm of conflict they do not. They do not act as a stimulus to offensive action as they do in cyberspace. So I think but at the same time, space assets are crucial for states in all realms, in particular the military ones. So states feel very vulnerable, and that creates an incentive at least to have deterrent capabilities in space, and that of course can lead to misunderstandings, to possible misreadings of one another. So I think that for the main thing we need to do now is to delegitimize this irresponsible behavior in space. I think that's a crucial first step. And I certainly hope we don't need a catastrophe in outer space, like a collision that disables crucial infrastructure in outer space to bring our minds together and start working earnestly on this.
Claudio, thank you very much, and my panelists, thank you as well. We now, the mosquito of time has now met the windshield of fate, and we must wrap this up. And I think my two takeaways from this is that multi-stakeholderism is probably the way to go forward, and my cause for pessimism may well be unfounded, and I hope that my fellow panelists are right. Thank you all to Daniel, Claudio, Laetitia, and Antonino, as well as also to the Observer Research Foundation. And we'll wrap this up now. Thank you very much.